Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and balance coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance. Welcome back to Bite Size Balance. Today we are talking about the future of work. Specifically, we're talking about the future of work for females. And it's a really, really interesting conversation. You may be wondering how this ties into women's burnout and balance. Don't worry, it does. Keep listening. I am here today with Rachel Sumner. Rachel is passionate about connecting learners with innovative experiences that build employability and has spoken and published on these topics around the world. She's the owner of the website futureofworkready.com, which supports young people and their families to become better informed about the future of work as they make those important decisions about life after high school. She's also currently serving as the founding executive director of Ontario Tech Talent, a wholly owned subsidiary of Ontario Tech University, which is intended to fuel Ontario's talent pipeline with job-ready graduates. Possessing a master's degree in education with a focus on curriculum training and the future of work, Rachel is a qualified teacher and has served as a faculty member and leader in the K-12 post-secondary education and corporate settings. Nominated 3 times for the RBC Canadian Women Entrepreneur Award, she is also a volunteer mentor for Lean in Canada and is certified by the UK's Institute of Leadership and Management as an executive coach and mentor. Currently pursuing her doctoral studies in higher education, Rachel is undertaking a comparative study of experiential learning design in North America, Europe, and Asia with a particular interest in education technology. As a mom of 3, one of whom is already in post-secondary education and one in the process of decision-making himself, she is acutely aware of the need for better education about the future of work so that our children not only survive, but thrive in the decades ahead. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Wendy. It's great to be here.
That is quite the bio. You're a very accomplished person. Full disclosure, I've known Rachel for quite a while now. Rachel used to live in Halifax, which is where I am. And we met through the female entrepreneur circles, I think. And we have stayed in touch over the years. And Rachel is just such an impressive person. And what we're going to be talking about today is a really interesting topic. We decided to talk about this today because we know that most of you listening to this podcast are mothers, first of all, and many of you are mothers of children who are teenagers or who are young adults and who are in the process of transitioning into post-secondary education and into the workforce. And also, if you don't have children, most of you are working. And so this podcast today, where we're going to be talking about the future of work, is going to be really focused on the future of work for women. And I think it's just a fascinating topic. The first time Rachel and I talked about this, it was really eye-opening for me. I hadn't even contemplated a lot of the points that she raised, and I thought would be really a great thing to share with all of you. So I'm excited about this conversation today. We've decided to call this podcast The Future of Women because it's such an exciting thing when you think about, and you'll see as we begin talking about all of the opportunities that are going to be available for women in the future when it comes to work that have not been available in the past. And in the shift that is occurring right now and will continue to happen towards valuing the skills that women typically and traditionally possess and exemplify more than men, to be honest. So, Rachel, let's get started. I want to talk first about this idea of the future of work, because I know the first time you said those words to me, I had no idea what you were talking about. So can you tell us, what does the future of work even mean, and why does it matter?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. And believe me, you're not alone. I did some research this year with young people about whether they understood what the future of work meant for them, and less than 40% actually even knew what that term meant. So we've got some work to do. So appreciate you asking the question. Typically, the future of work relates to 4 different issues or opportunities. The first, most of us are more familiar with, which is around how automation is going to change the workplace, the economy, machines and AI being used to replace workers. We've heard about that, some of us, but also the creation of new jobs through that as well. Then the second piece is around the changing economy itself, how it's structured. And you may have heard the term the gig economy, which relates to um, a different way of creating economic opportunities for ourselves. So rather than the traditional notion of a single job through a lifetime, and we may have multiple jobs back to back, instead of looking for a single job, we actually look for a portfolio of economic activities. One of those might be a little bit of entrepreneurial work, one could be a part-time job, some could be some contract work, but that together that really is what we do to remain economically active, and that will become more the norm, that there will be less and less full-time jobs. And then the third thing really is around uh, wages, quite honestly, and whether we as humans can maintain a living wage in this future of work that we're anticipating. For example, if we are experiencing that gig economy and have small pieces of different kinds of economic activity, can we collectively earn enough to pay our rent, put food on the table, etc., etc.? That's a concern for the future, I think. And then the fourth piece, which is probably not the bigger piece, but actually very interesting given the changes we've all experienced in 2020, is how is the workplace going to change itself? What will it mean to go to work? That is going to change significantly in the future. So those are the kind of four areas that typically we're talking about when we consider the future of work.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Yeah, the automation piece is fascinating, and I've listened to lots of different podcasts and read different articles about the increasing automation in the workplace. Some of the other pieces that you just talked about, though, are things that I knew nothing about before I started talking to you. So we're gonna go through and talk about each of those pieces as we continue this conversation. How did you get interested in this field of work, Rachel?
Great question. I myself transitioned career in my late 20s, where I'd gone to work for Unilever as a market analyst. I'm an economist originally by training, and then realized that work really didn't align well with my own values. And so thought about the kind of skills that I possessed, and how might they be used differently. And actually that's the point at which I decided to get into education. So I went back and retrained as a high school teacher originally. And then when I got to the high school environment, a particular student that I was working with, in an interesting way, he had a need for some accommodations to help him in his studies, but very focused himself on where he was going with his working life. And so we began to talk about even simple things about what I was teaching him and how frankly irrelevant it was, Wendy, to what I already knew was going to be the workplace he was going to be dealing with in just a few short years. I just left it essentially as I exited Unilever and retrained, and began to think, this is not acceptable, that we're not equipping our young people with the knowledge and the skills they need that are actually relevant to the workplace. And then of course the bigger thing, as I began to explore this further, was that what we were offering our young people, and even what we were experiencing ourselves, is very much a product of history and not in any way future focused. I've got, as and thank you for calling it out earlier, I've got young people myself in my family who are making these decisions about their future, and very ill-equipped through what school's providing them, what the media is telling them about the future of work. And so it all began to come together as an area of interest for me, and really I've been exploring it for 20 years now in different ways, trying to help young people just understand better the skills, frankly, that they need and how to get those skills. And in that, as you said earlier, there's a growing recognition that the skills that women typically have and focus on are going to be of increasing value.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Before we get into that, because I really want to spend some time on that. That's why that's really why I wanted to have you on this podcast, because I'm all about girl power in any form. So I just love the fact that it doesn't happen very often that things start just sort of naturally shifting in favor of women. And so the fact that this is happening is really pretty exciting to me. But before we get into that, you talked about how you have one child in post-secondary right now, and one who's about to go. I have a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old. They're in grade 11. They're both in this process of trying to figure out, what they want to do. And you and I had a conversation recording this podcast,
Yeah.
we were talking about, how challenging it is and how different it is now from or how actually it's the same. It should be different is the conversation
Right.
we're having, right? So when I was trying to decide what to do after high school, there were certain routes that were sort of the expected routes for me to go, given what I had excelled at in school, and I just kind of followed that path. So I was kind of guided on that path by my family, by guidance counselors, mentors, that kind of thing. And I ended up on this path. And the path was really like, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? That was the path. And that was the choice, and I felt like that was a very imposing thing to be deciding as a 17-year-old who had no idea what she wanted to be doing, honestly. And as it turns out, it wasn't what I wanted to be doing. And I ended up, practicing law for 12 years and then eventually leaving that after burning out in that job. And what we were talking about earlier was this idea of, the shift that's happening, and how what we need to be doing is that shift needs to be reflected more in terms of how we support our kids in making decisions around where they go next and what they're going to do. And the question, if I have it right, is less of like, what do you want to do for the rest of your life?
Truly.
And more of, look, we don't even know what that job's going to look like in 5 years or 10 years. So choosing one job right now is kind of your life path, one kind of life path for employment, doesn't really make sense anymore. And I think we're still encouraging kids to do that, to be honest. That's been my experience with guidance counselors and with, the conversations I've had with teachers and other people around, and other parents, frankly, around making choices about post-secondary and then education after that. But it doesn't really make sense given what we're going to talk about today. And that's really the reason why we wanted to do this podcast, I think, is because, again, most of the listeners of this podcast are women, and many of them are mothers. And we're in this right now, trying to support our kids through this. We're going to spend some time talking about how to better support our kids around this piece. But I just wanted to connect that in, because people might be thinking, why is Wendy doing a podcast on the topic of the future of work? How does that connect to bite-sized balance? And it connects in a really, really real way for us as working women, but also as working mothers. So I just wanted, that's a little aside, but I wanted to get that out there.
No, I think important, Wendy. Thanks for doing that.
So if we can just go through, I think lots of people who are listening to this probably aren't aware of some of the things that are just, second nature to you now in terms of those 4 aspects of the future of work. So let's talk first about the first one, which is automation. Can you just explain what that, when we talk about the future of work being automation, what you mean by that?
Yeah, of course. Really, in the context of what we're talking about today, it's looking at the way in which machines, will be used to replace humans in the workforce. That a lot of the skills that we can actually program machines to do will replace the human contribution of that type in the workforce. And to your point about the future being female, of course, that's the kind of skills and activities that, frankly, men are more typically engaged in the workforce that will be replaced. And although the research is showing currently that men and women face a similar level of displacement in terms of the future of work, meaning jobs being lost because of this future we're envisaging and jobs being created because of the future. In fact, in many ways, I think women are going to have the advantage about the new jobs that are going to emerge because, as I just mentioned, the skills that men typically have are going to be easily replaceable by machines, less so those skills that women typically excel in, such as empathy and compassion and collaboration and creativity. They are actually going to be the things as humans that make us more valuable in the future of work. And so I'm really excited about that because I think, to your point, for the first time ever, we can see this pivot point where the traditional male-dominated workplace is actually going to become more female, just in its very nature.
Yeah, I think that's so amazing. All of these skills that, frankly, have been largely devalued.
Truly.
And certainly were devalued for me when I was going through that decision-making process of where am I going to go and what am I going to do with my life and work and, the things we're talking about kind of typical sort of soft skills, right?
Right.
These like emotional skills and caring skills. Those were not things that were valued in my career as a lawyer, for example. They don't play into that. And I think it's so amazing that we're now at a place where we can say these are actually going to become very valuable, and you can actually factor these skills that you naturally have, which frankly are probably largely in alignment with what matters to you as a human being, right? So they feel good to you.
Yes.
They're in alignment with your values. You're actually going to be able to factor those in with great value in terms of your decisions around where you go and what you do.
Right.
Which was not something that was available to me, or it didn't feel like it was available to me anyway when I was 17 or 18 years old making decisions. So I think that's really exciting.
And I think, if I may, to your point about, the way guidance is provided to young people at the moment, it still doesn't reflect that. And that is a real opportunity, I think, for us to be of better service to the young people in our lives, is to make sure that we have them rethink their future opportunities around this, and focus on the skills, the human skills, what makes us human, Wendy, rather than anything else as they envisage their future in the workforce.
Right, of course, because obviously robots can't do the really human stuff. And you said something when we were chatting before we hit record on this podcast. I loved. You said, instead of I'm probably not going to get it exactly right, but you said sort of, instead of like asking our kids, what is it you want to do?
Right.
We should be thinking about asking them, what are the problems that you want to solve?
Yeah, I think the way that you mentioned it, the way we look at, our working lives, has typically been through job titles, job roles. As you said, when asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? The answer is typically, a job role. I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a construction worker, or I want to be an architect or a lawyer. That's how we're trained. We have been trained to think about our working lives. And to your point about, I'm 16 and I'm supposed to make that decision now for the rest of my life, I often joke about the fact I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up. And I think it's really important that we reframe that for young people nowadays, because we don't know what those jobs are going to be. We don't know whether a job is going to be anybody's future anymore. It may be, as I said, a myriad of things in this gig economy. So why don't we reframe that for our young people? And as you said, think about maybe the problems they want to solve, because what that allows for as well is then, if I'm passionate about a specific problem, and that might not be something that, is a lifetime's work, but if that's then for the next 5 years, I want to spend my time, my energy, my passion on this particular problem, that lends itself really nicely to a question around, what are the skills I'm going to need to develop to help solve that problem? And so then, where do I need to go to acquire those skills? That may be post-secondary, it may not be, it may be an apprenticeship, it may be, learning on the job. It may be a different ways of looking at how we build that skills inventory for ourselves as we enter the workplace, but then frankly as we move through our working lives as well, keeping connected purposefully to what are the skills I need to be sort of maintaining and acquiring and developing to remain employable.
Yeah, I love that, because it's less about what do I need to learn to do this job, and more about how do I need to be.
Yes.
Right. And of course, I'm all about being as a coach, less about doing, more about being. We are human beings. How do we want to be? But the other piece that excites me about this as a burnout coach is that, for many of the women that I work with, a piece of the burnout that they struggle with is that they are doing a job that they probably do it incredibly well. And they are working very, very hard at that job, but that job is not really resonant for them. So it's not something that it isn't actually related to a problem they want to solve, or the way that they want to be, the things, the skills and things that really matter to them. And so that can be a huge contributing factor to burnout in terms of the satisfaction that you get from your job. So looking at your future as an employable person from the perspective of cultivating a set of skills that are in alignment with what matters to you, and also in relation to problems that you're actually interested in solving, to me is just a natural way to also decrease burnout. Um,
Yeah.
we're going to talk more about burnout as we go forward, and some more brings John some more specific connections to the burnout piece. But I just thought of that as you were chatting.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about the gig economy. Is that like
Yeah.
GIG for people listening?
Yes, it is exactly
Yeah,
GIG, the
yeah,
gig economy, and I think, if I may, I'll focus on the connection to women in that answer, Wendy, because the reality is women have been more so than men living in the gig economy for a long time, because of our myriad responsibilities. And I know you call it the different shifts we have. We've had to be more creative. Again, that great female skill around creativity there, of finding ways to participate in the economy, to get a part-time job that fits around, for example, picking up and dropping off our children from school, or setting up a small business, because again, that gives us a flexibility and control over the time we need because of those other responsibilities or those other shifts we have to engage in a day. So I think women have an advantage there as well, quite honestly, because they are more attuned already to participate that way, to look for opportunities in that way, to be economically active, that doesn't require them to be 9 to 5, in a given space doing a specific job. So I'm really excited that, again, women will have an advantage there. I also think that it means that new opportunities will emerge for women as well to participate economically, because we talked about it earlier. I think employers are looking more for gig workers, gig economy workers, meaning business and industry and even government catching up. Is the pace of change is such now, is they're not as interested in hiring somebody for life any longer. They're looking to bring in the resource with the talent and the skills they need for a specific problem that they have to solve, and then not necessarily retain that individual afterwards. And so they're looking at more flexible ways of how do you bring in those skills that they need. And so I think those two things are really going to drive this forward to women's advantage, quite honestly. But then that connects with that third piece I mentioned about, can you make a living wage out of this? We touched when we talked earlier on about universal basic income,
Mhm.
and whether that's part of our Canadian future, to ensure that as people transition into this gig economy, that we can all make our bills, quite honestly. So I think, again, this is another great example where the future is female.
Yeah, no, that's true. And we were also talking about universal childcare
Right.
as a piece of that, because I think those things are pretty connected for women in terms of
Hugely.
women's ability to make a living wage.
Truly, and participate in the workforce. We do still, research tells us we do still more significantly bear, and forgive me for framing it this way, but the burden of the childcare responsibilities within our families. And so, as such, we are forsaking our ability to participate in the workforce because of that.
Right. Yeah. And that's connected to the last piece in terms of the fourth aspect of the future of work, which is
Yeah.
what the workplace actually looks like. And as you said, we've seen a real shift, like kind of an acceleration of that,
Right.
I think,
Right.
during the course of this pandemic in 2020.
Oh yeah.
So many of us are
Yeah.
working from home and have had to
Right.
pivot and shift in terms of how we work,
Yeah.
and what our physical workplace and what that looks like has changed
Right.
as well.
Right.
So what's the impact of that on women?
Yeah, I think a number of things. And it's funny, there's or not funny, it's kind of tragic, because we were doing so well. All of these things about the future of work were accelerating women's participation in the labor market, in the economy. And then the pandemic hits, and goodness me, I don't mean to suggest that this is more important than the lives lost to the pandemic, but women have really suffered as a result of the pandemic this year. We're seeing we're seeing the kind of participation from women in the labor market right now that existed 30 years ago. We've gone back 30 years in terms of female participation in Canada.
Wow.
That is incredible. I mean, I think about where I was in the late 80s, if I can do my math right, and that was 30 years ago. Because now that feels like it shouldn't be, but you know where I'm coming from there. But it's the point being, we were marching ahead, and suddenly this huge opposing force has thrown us backwards. And when I talk about participation, there's talk of this being a she session, using the word recession and then applying that female pronoun to it, the she session, because we've seen more women impacted, losing their jobs through the pandemic, than we've seen men. We've seen men coming back to the workforce faster than we've seen women for, the reasons such as childcare that you've just spoken about. And as we know, women's participation is in this much higher in the sectors that have been most impacted by the pandemic, such as retail, such as childcare, such as hospitality. Those were the first, sadly, businesses to close, if not permanently, at least pull the shutters down for a while. And so, women were forced out of the labor market and then are struggling to get back in. And
Right.
I think that's a real disappointment for those of us that, as I said, we're kind of seeing this wonderful momentum towards the future of female and aligning with the future of work. So, government, industry is saying, if we're going to return Canada to the kind of productivity and growth trajectory that we need to recover, we've got to get women back to work.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily mean back to a job. And as I said earlier, I think that's one of the huge opportunities here. How can we help the women who already were working within that gig economy find new opportunities here to be economically active again, if it doesn't mean necessarily going back to their job waitressing or in childcare or whatever?
Right. Yeah. And it seems to me, from everything I'm hearing, that the changes to the workplace in terms of more people working from home that have happened as a result of the pandemic are not temporary.
No,
Even if the
exactly.
pandemic, even when the
Yeah.
pandemic resolves and we get to a place where we have the ability to easily work together again, it doesn't seem like that's going to necessarily be the norm for a lot of these
No,
companies.
no, I think a lot of companies, employers are looking at now more of an opportunity for flexible work scheduling. I think, they're looking at it from both a cost perspective. For example, why would we hold, the overhead of a huge office building when we don't frankly need to do that anymore? But I think they're also looking at it, and I'm really encouraged by this from the perspective of a workplace and satisfaction from work. There are a lot of people that would benefit massively from being able to work at home, even if it was a couple of days a week. So how can you, improve that work experience for employees by offering them that flexibility? But I know you, through your practice, have seen different kind of outcomes for your clients this year in terms of shifting to work from home, some benefiting from it and some not. So I think it's going to be, I think ultimately it's a choice that's made available, but it's not forced on an individual. And I know you shared some of your stories with me, about kind of the themes that you're seeing about the impact of that.
Yeah, I'm seeing. I think what I was saying is that I'm seeing kind of two. It's really split in terms of the women that I work with. So 50% of them would say it's easier for them to maintain balance working from home,
Right.
and to prevent burnout, or recover from burnout. And for the other 50%, it's just incredibly more challenging.
Yeah.
And they're really struggling with it. And we were talking about this pre-podcast as well. This idea of it's not just the first and second shift anymore for women, which would be the work shift and then the home care and caregiver shift. It's the first, second, and third shift, because a lot of us have become part-time teachers.
Right.
We're trying to manage education. We're trying to manage distance learning for our kids. We're trying to, even if our kids are lucky enough, as they are currently right now in Nova Scotia, my kids are in school, fingers crossed, it stays that way. And we're very lucky that that's the situation we have here. But even in that situation, there are additional stressors and challenges around supporting your kids when they're going to school during the pandemic, because it's a very different, it looks very different. And my kids, for example, are doing 2.5-hour class blocks.
Right.
So they're studying, complicated grade 11 math for 2.5 hours. And, it's difficult to focus for an hour in a class, let alone for 2.5 hours straight. So there are different things. And so I'm still feeling like I'm doing extra support in terms of that third shift, even right now, while my kids are luckily back in school for the time being. So I'm seeing, overall, I would say it's contributing to higher rates of burnout for sure. Research is showing us that. It's showing us that women are, in particular, are struggling. So they're being impacted more. Rates of, for example, rates of dependency on alcohol have skyrocketed with women as a result of this pandemic, and just trying to cope, just trying to get through it. So there's definitely a connection here, a link here to burnout with what we're seeing during the pandemic. But what I'm really interested in talking about as well is the connection between the future, this future of work, and what that looks like for women, and the connection with burnout rates for women, because it seems to me like something needs to shift. We need to be doing things differently in order to prevent burnout rates from just continuing to rise here. Because if women are going to be working more from home, that obviously can, for I would say the majority of women find that more stressful, more challenging in terms of maintaining balance and preventing burnout. So women are going to be working more from home as we go forward. And as you're saying, women are going to be increasingly working in a way where they're using those soft skills, those emotional skills, those the caring and the coping, and because there's going to be a greater demand for that. Yeah. And that is, you know, for many of us, it is a natural place for us to fall in terms of you know, not all women, and of course we're generalizing here with all of this, and certainly not all men don't all lack soft skills. It's just that whether it's nature or nurture, we as a sex typically demonstrate those skills more and better. And I think there's research to that effect, right?
Yeah, and it's what society has valued in us traditionally. Right. So not only may we bring it more naturally, and you know, we're nurtured accordingly, but society, the economy has required that of us. That was how we were supposed to participate. So I think there's a number of things to unpack there. But to your point about what this means for the future for women, and the increased emphasis on those human skills, I think for women and men, how do we maintain the resiliency that we're going to need when the burden of work is predominantly around emotional and mental work, because the machines will be doing the rest. Right. So how do we not burn out at a higher rate, and frankly faster, I think, than even before? Because all we're doing all day long, not only in our home lives but our working lives now, is giving, is caring.
And I was saying this to you earlier, like typically the women that I work with are highly successful, very busy, driven women. Right. And they are almost always find themselves in the place they find themselves as a result of both professional burnout and caregiver burnout. So those things, they're not separate for most of the women I work with. They are dovetailed together. They are under extreme pressure and stress at work, but they're also under extreme pressure and stress as caregivers, whether that's caregivers to their children, to their aging parents, to their spouse, other family members. They have been caring for years. And this interestingly ties into previous podcasts that I did with Sarah Bailey, which I know you've listened to, where we talked about how, you know, we're primed to be carers as a result of the amount of estrogen that we produce. That's our dominant hormone. And estrogen is the nurturing hormone. And so it makes sense that we've been caring. Right. It also makes sense that this is a soft skill we possess because we have more estrogen. Anyway, the burnout is very often a combination of the caregiver burnout and the professional burnout. And what I was saying earlier is that it feels to me like the future of work is actually that those two things are now actually together in the workplace. So now you have the potential for professional burnout based on mental, the taxing nature and the physical stress of working all day long. Connected and directly kind of in parallel with that, you have this caregiver stress that comes from just nurturing and caring all day long and using all of those emotional soft skills all day. So it sounds like to me a recipe for increased burnout rates.
Sadly, I think it is.
In women and men, frankly. So if men are holding those jobs, in men as well.
Yeah. And I think actually maybe the interesting point about men is for many women, they may have found coping strategies. They may not be effective coping strategies, but they found coping strategies to handle that level of emotional burden they carry because of the caring that they're delivering all the time. I wonder what we're going to see in terms of men, in terms of related to that point where suddenly if they're expected to bring more of those soft skills, those caring skills, those skills for collaboration that maybe are not either naturally theirs or that they've not spent time developing over the years and now suddenly are supposed to bring to the workplace, I think there's an even more increased chance of burnout amongst men, quite honestly, because they won't have those coping strategies to, as my youngest would say, refill their bucket.
Yeah.
as it's being rapidly emptied by, the giving and caring of others.
Yeah, you might be absolutely right with that, Rachel. And I think it doesn't matter whether we're talking about men or women in these roles going forward. It it seems pretty clear that some things need to change before we get there. Otherwise, we're setting ourselves up for that just overwhelmed burnout. And so, what can we do now
Right.
to both prepare ourselves for that shift in work, assuming we're at a stage um, in our own employment where we know we're going to be working, for another 10, 20, 30 years,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Yeah.
And how do we do that for our kids? So what can we do to prepare our kids for the future of work and what that looks like, which is really, as we said earlier, like completely different from what we're telling them it's going to look like, right? Like it's
Yeah.
nothing like what we're telling them it's going to look like.
Yeah.
Our kids are still doing tests that basically throw them into, oh, well, you've got this, you have these interests. Well, this is what you should be this. You should be this. You should be that, right? And as you said, many of those jobs won't even be jobs in 5 years. And if 10 years, and if they are jobs, they will look very, very different. So whatever it is they think they're signing up for is not actually going to be what they have signed up for. So what can we do to prepare our kids?
Yeah.
I know I have some ideas. I'd love to hear your
Let's throw
thoughts.
them around then. Let's throw them together then. I mean, I think the first thing, I mean, and you've touched on it really, is to be very mindful about how we talk about work ourselves. I think you and I have talked about before about, how do we define success as individuals, but even the way we frame that for our children in our lives, I think is going to need to shift. Um, the way we talk about our working day, even, I know mine listen to it, and ask questions about, what does that mean, and what does that look like? And of course, now we're all home, they're seeing it more and they're listening more, to what we're talking about how we engage with our colleagues, about how we approach our working lives in ways that when we used to leave and go and do that somewhere else, it was a bit of a mystery. And mine would even say to me, what does that job title mean, mum? When I would say, oh, I've just got this new role and this is it, then they'd be like, well, what does that actually mean? Because really, what does a job title ever really mean? So I think being very mindful about how we talk about work with our young people is important. Also acknowledging exactly what you just said. We don't really know exactly what the future is going to bring, and that we should not set them up expecting, that things will remain constant in the future. That has long been, a redundant way of looking at our professional lives. So let's stop talking about that and become better educated ourselves about what we do know about the future of work, but also be open to the fact there's a lot of unknowns at the moment, and we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable around that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm wondering how many people listening to this podcast have had a conversation with their teens. I'm going to put my hand up and say I have not officially done this yet.
Yeah.
But I'm going to, after this podcast at some point, have a conversation with my kids about, like, it's all well and good for you to be thinking that you want to do this or do that. But the truth is, this is probably not, there's no certainty in any of this. In fact, there's more certainty in the fact that this won't be available to you in this way that you think it's going to be available to you. And I want to, I'm looking forward to having that conversation. But I think any conversation you have with your teenagers, especially where you don't actually know what you're talking about, never goes very well. So hopefully this podcast will serve. Really my goal with this podcast was to have this conversation with you so that other parents could start thinking about this and thinking about how they talk to their kids about the future, their futures. The other piece of it that I wanted to touch on is I think it's really important to talk to our kids about how we work and how they might work in the future and what that looks like. But I also think it's very important to remember the power that we have as role models, as parents.
Right.
So when we're talking about this idea of, like, to both of us, it seems like there's a relatively good chance that burnout rates will rise as a result of this shift. And so one of the things that you don't ever want to lose sight of as a parent is your power to role model when it comes to balance, and that whole idea of work-life balance and what that looks like. And I actually think there's a great gift in COVID, in this pandemic, for us as parents to role model that. And I've been trying very hard to role model that with my kids, because they, when they're out of the house and they're at school, and I'm out of the house at a job, and my husband's out at his working out of his office, they don't get to see that balance in
It's
action.
invisible to them. Yeah.
Yeah, there's actually an opportunity to role model that for them now, to say, this is what my busy day looks like, and here's how I make sure that I stay balanced. For example, I do my meal prep in the morning, which many people listening to this podcast know. So I do that before I start work in the morning, so that there will be something to eat for dinner. And I exercise, I slot exercises actually in my calendar. Here, look at my calendar. You'll see I have exercise actually in there, and I schedule clients and meetings around that to ensure that it happens. There's real power as parents to actually role model that balance and do it in a really intentional, conscious, out loud way, like actually talk about it with our kids. And I think that's important as well.
Yeah, I think, you're absolutely right in your point about our kids look to us for certainty, and I think as they grow, that relationship needs to shift, because I think you begin to realize your parents are only human too, and they actually don't know everything about the world. And then so I think it's really appropriate that we have those conversations around the future of work being ambiguous, because frankly, living in ambiguity and working in ambiguity is one of the ability to do that. It's one of the strongest, in most in demand skills, quite right now. So how do we help them be okay in that and not suffer, the kind of emotional or anxieties that are often attached to that? I think that's huge as well, in terms of how we can help them move through that sort of transition process after high school. And certainly, my goal for the futureofworkready.com was to have some resources available to parents to support those conversations in such a way that it didn't cause anxiety or fear, but actually just increased awareness, and provided some strategies to help young people make these important decisions.
Yeah, I think that's I think it's really important work. I think it's really important to have those resources available. So I'm really excited about the fact that you're building that platform. I think that's going to be a fantastic resource. So, what can we've talked about the impact that the pandemic has had on women in the workplace. And what are some of the things that we can do to address those negative impacts and accelerate the positive stuff? Like, how can we make the best of a pretty crummy situation?
And it was looking so good, like we
What's
said.
the upside of the downside here?
Okay, I'm always one for the silver lining, so let's try and find it together. I think there's a number of things, quite honestly. I think the recognition that this reality of the gig economy is only going to increase now, I think is one of those opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, for women who already participate in the gig economy to do so even better. And I think to look for ways, frankly, to sell the skills we have is really important as women. It's difficult to put your shingle out and say, these are the skills that I excel in and that might be of value to you, potential employer or potential client, if you're looking for a contract piece of work. But I think getting better at articulating your skills is really going to be critical to our success in the future in terms of our own marketability in this new type of economy. I think recognizing your point earlier about looking for opportunities to work on the problems that really light us up, that align with our values, I think is something that that given that we have this moment to pause and reflect, could be some good work to do as we recover, as the she recovery or the she covery maybe starts to happen. But I think as well, as parents, for those of us that are thinking about how we can use this time to really engage in those conversations at home about our caring responsibilities. This is a point at which I think it really important we have those, often I know, tough conversations about the responsibilities that, if you live in a two-parent household, may fall on one of those two parents more significantly than others, and as we know, often the female. So let's start having those conversations now about life after this pandemic, about more appropriate sharing. And that doesn't necessarily mean 50-50. It's so unique to each family's situation, but how can we get women back to work more effectively? We're going to have that conversation about childcare responsibilities in that second and third shift
Right.
that you were talking about, Wendy. So I think if there's a silver lining, if we can find, that if we can leverage our skills to have those conversations and get to a better place around that, that could be a really positive outcome from all of this that sees even greater long-term female participation in the workforce, quite honestly.
What about, we're both parents of boys.
Yes.
You have two boys?
Yes, two boys and a girly.
Yeah, two boys, and I have one boy and a girl. So
Yeah.
as parents of boys,
Yeah.
what conversations can we be having with them to help prepare them for the future? I was just thinking, as you were talking about having those candid conversations between the adults in the house, I
Yeah.
guess, about how the sharing is going to go with respect to that second shift work and the third shift work.
Mm.
I was thinking to myself, that's a conversation that should be happening also with our boys.
Mm-hmm.
We should be, because the future is that. That is the
Right.
future. If the future is female in terms of the work, then
Yeah.
the future has to be also a shift in terms of this second shift sharing,
Right.
this responsibility of these other
Right.
duties, right? So I think that's something that we probably need to be talking to our kids about, our boys about. But what about in terms of preparing them to be better able to take on these roles that involve more soft skills? What can we be doing in that department?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it goes back to your point earlier about the role model opportunity that we have here. And that comes out of that maybe hard conversation with your significant other about who undertakes these roles in the home that then our boys and girls witness, about that shared responsibility for the household, for the caring aspect of life as an adult with young people in it, or even frankly caring for our parents, our aging parents too. Whose responsibility is that? I think that's another opportunity to role model together both the male and female responsibilities around that. And I only use male and female there because, the traditional ways in which that's viewed, it's often the woman who takes on the burden of the caring for both sets of aging parents as well. I see that time and time again where I hear women say, my brothers are not interested in caring for our parents. They might throw a bit of money at me every now and again to help with it, but actually in terms of the activities, then they just won't give the time to it or the energy to it. So I think the role model piece is huge, showing our boys and our girls that this is a shared responsibility, and looking maybe at your household as an economic unit, and what needs to work for whom when, and actually starting to talk to your young people about what is their role in the household to make this all work as well, really important. But to your point about the soft skills piece, is not lost on me, because I think, I certainly observe, and as you said, I've got two boys and a girl, and the different skills that again appear more naturally aligned amongst them is, how do we help our boys work on those soft skills? I don't even like that term, but the kind of human skills, and make sure they're aware of that growing importance of them in their ability to be an effective contributor in the workforce. I think that's a huge opportunity for us as women who've become experts often in these skills,
Right.
to help the men in our lives, young and old, really, to do it better, to develop these skills. And again, like some women and some men, some of this is going to be harder to develop, but I think we can take an active role in that and create opportunities even at home to do that. Collaboration is one of those skills that again are typically women are understood to be more effective in. So the next time there's an opportunity for collaboration at home, bring the boys into that, to actually be part of a collaborative experience, and then explicitly talk about what does collaboration mean and what does that need from you, as a young man, to participate in a collaborative experience and practice it at home. Home, if we're lucky, is a safe space to test these things and play with these skills before we go out into the big scary world of work, or even when we go off to post-secondary, if that's our particular pathway. So the more we can help them practice these skills at home, I really think the better. And I think your point about being very explicit about this with them is not lost on me as an educator, because learning sometimes to be effective, has to be very explicitly called out. And I think often some of these things, and I don't know about anybody else, but given the distractions of digital devices that my teenagers seem to have some trouble with at times, they're not as present and cognizant of what's going on around them as they might be. So really explicitly calling this out when it's happening, I think, is helpful for that point of recognition of it taking place too.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Rachel. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope people listening have found it as fascinating as I have. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me today. Where can people find you if they want to find more about what you do?
Thank you. Certainly, futureofworkready.com is the site where we'll be continuing to grow, resources available for parents and young people who are looking to learn more about the future of work, and and how they can best prepare for it, and also how they can get information that might help them making the decisions around those sort of post high school pathways. So love to see people go there. Equally, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, so please, at RA Sumner, so feel free to follow me there. I'm hoping, and I'm happy to answer any questions, Wendy, so if anybody connects with you and wants my contact details, feel free to share them. I'd love to continue this conversation in any way that's helpful to others.
That's great. Thank you. I will do that, Rachel. Thanks again for being a guest today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for the time.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. To be sure you don't miss any upcoming Bite Size conversations, subscribe now to this podcast. For more balance and wellness tips, or to connect with me, visit my website at wendymccallum.com. That's WENDYMCCALLUM.com.